Weddings. They're fine. Everybody loves beautiful young couples in love. What does the church have to say about weddings? They're great, the same as everybody else. Baptisms, they're better. The blessing of new life, it's welcome into the community of faith. But again, the church is kind of saying that babies are wonderful and a great gift, and that's what pretty much everyone else tends to think too. Funerals. Now we're talking. This is where the church earns its keep. With no disrespect to Beatrice and the baptism, which I am very much going to enjoy today, funerals are nevertheless my favourite. Because here the church does have something unique to say. Death is dreadful, yes, but we have a hope that is much more powerful than death, a promise of life. And that is something with which the world cannot compete. And actually, for Christians, the rites of baptism and funerals, whilst often separated by very many years, are nevertheless quite close in meaning. St. Paul teaches us that as the waters come over us in baptism, so we join Jesus Christ in his death. That as we emerge from the waters, so we claim for ourselves his resurrection. For Christians, and particularly in this season, this Easter season, life and death and new life, they all swim very close together. Today we heard Jesus talking about life and about death. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and the hired hand does not. You will be familiar with this experience. Our leaders often disappoint us in this way, don't they? Fleeing when things get difficult, taking care principally of themselves. This was exemplified for John's community by the Pharisees, and John puts these words of Jesus in his mouth as he's speaking to the Pharisees. In 70 AD, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and Jerusalem under siege, the Pharisees fled. They left their people behind. They moved to a neighbouring village of Jamnia. Jesus is presenting himself in contrast to that as the good shepherd, the suffering Messiah, the one who lays down his life for the flock. In John's first letter, we come to understand that these actions of Jesus are not just things that he is called to do, but things that we are called to do too. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. We are to share in this ministry, being willing to give our lives. And sometimes in the life of the church, that has meant martyrdom. Sometimes it has meant literally dying for one's faith. For us, it is much more likely to mean investing our lives, laying our lives down for one another by investing them, investing our time, our talents, our money in one another. Now, for most of us, I suspect that the temptation when the wolf arrives is to run, just like the hired hand. What is it in our lives that can help us to prevent ourselves from doing that? Well, there are three things that I thought of. One is the love of the sheep, or the love of one another. And we foster that by praying for one another regularly, by praying for one another's flourishing and good health and well-being. And then there's another thought that comes through the Gospels quite regularly, that the sheep know the voice of their real shepherd because he spends time with them, she spends time with them. And that the shepherd therefore smells a bit like the sheep. It is the investment of our time, our spending time in fellowship together, that helps us not to run away when things get tough. And then it's also a love of God. It is doing what we have been told to do. Love one another, just as I have loved you. And in another place, Jesus is speaking to his disciples. He says, whichever of you is to be the greatest must be the servant of all. And then finally, I think it is about not fearing the outcome of such a commitment. If we care only for ourselves, we often seek to suffer the least hardship, to make our lives as pleasant as possible, to minimise pain and suffering. When taking care of ourselves is forfeited in favour of caring for others, then that's no longer guaranteed. Some of the decisions that we make will be best for others, but they will have negative impacts on our own well-being, ranging from slight frustration at one end to death at the other. And ultimately, if we are going to learn to stay with the sheep as the good shepherd and not flee as the hired hand does, then we have got to master that fear. We have to master our fear of death. Last week I started saying to you that there are things worse than death for a Christian, but I didn't really expand the idea. And in fact, when I listened back to the sermon as I was preparing to upload it, it was a real non sequitur in the middle. I think it was one of those thoughts that had kind of half formed in my mind and then didn't fully make it past my teeth. So let me try again today. The world condemned to death Jesus' message and practices of reconciliation and of radical love. They were seen, quite rightly, as being a threat to the way that the world did its business. And then in raising Jesus from the dead, God overrules the world's no with a much more powerful yes. In the resurrection, the world is shown that its brokenness doesn't have the last word, that the beauty of love that is God's desire for creation ultimately triumphs even when we do our best to kill it. And everything that Jesus does in his life, his invitation to us, to all humanity, into that vision, into that new way of being, despite it seeming like a failure at the time of his execution, it is shown to all be worthwhile. Jesus chooses to do this. This is what John teaches us. No one takes it from me, says Jesus, but I lay it down of my own accord. You remember the film by Martin Scorsese, The Last Temptation of Christ. It's all set around this idea that Jesus' final temptation is in the moments just before his crucifixion, where he has the power to call down the legions of angels if he desires, to have this cup taken away from him, just like he prays in the garden. And he has to overcome that temptation and to face death head on. He didn't want it to happen to him, but he didn't want to be released from it if that would mean betraying his mission. He didn't want to live if that would undermine all that he was about, being the living, embodied, divine invitation to a new and a better way of life in love. For Jesus, betraying the divine mission he was charged with would be worse than death. Allowing the powerful to silence the work that he and his disciples were doing by giving it up would have been worse than death. Turning away from love and from the God of love would have been worse than death. Death is dreadful, but if we are willing to give anything to avoid it, we may find that we have held on to our lives at too great a cost. If you have not found something worth dying for, then have you really found something worth living for? Jesus' death reminds us that there are things worse than death, like turning away from a life of meaning and mission and vision, or being so preoccupied with our own happiness and health to the detriment of others, or as St. John says, having this world's goods and failing to help those in need. Jesus' resurrection is a testimony to us that death never has the last word. God promises to bring new life out of death. And therefore we are free to live recklessly loving lives, because on balance, To fail to do so would be worse for us than death. Amen.